All right, so I mentioned an emotion that most dominates the lives of the typical modern person. So we can speculate a little bit what you think that I might have had in mind, and then I can share what I had in mind. Once we've kind of got that a little bit of a groundwork of what we're talking about, which may take a while, maybe we'll go into some depth about it. Ultimately, I would like to talk about the results available, and this is we'll be speculating a little bit as well as reporting. We'll talk about the results available through restoring balance, and by restoring balance, I mean if one emotion really dominates someone's life, then to have it be less dominant, to have the other emotions be more prominent, and that emotion to be less prominent. That's what I mean by restoring balance. So, what are other results available in that event of having more emotional balance? And then what would be some ways to promote that outcome of balance, of an equity between the various emotional alternatives. So we've got Robert and Daniel to join me today. I had mentioned that I was planning to ask Robert first to speculate what he thinks might be the most dominant emotion for the typical person. We'll just say within the United States for convenience. Somebody who's gone through public schools, somebody who's exposed to some of the mainstream media, and so on. So, Robert, do you have any thoughts so far?
Dominant emotions. You're just talking about one?
Yep, and I would give you a tiny bit of guidance to say it is an emotion that many people would call a negative emotion. Or you might even say the most negative.
What comes to mind is fear.
Okay. Say more about that.
I think my perception is, and I'm not feeling highly accurate about saying this is for the U.S., but I don't know. I guess from my consciousness around the input and feedback I get from various sources of friends and connections I have about the state of affairs in the U.S. And I guess I say that collectively. I think there's a lot of mistrust in politics, in corporate America, and what I would label as the global elite or the elite of America and beyond. Yeah.
So how does that relate to fear?
How does that relate to me?
To fear.
To fear?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, I think that it's a state of mind that's brought by collective focus on the perception of what's going on outside of the body.
So we're looking out at social developments and what?
And projecting the worst possible scenario.
Okay. So so fear is a very big category. So when you say projecting the worst possible scenario, you want to say more specifically what emotion that could be?
Repeat that again?
So fear is a very general emotion. We could say that there's a variety of types of fear. You said projecting the worst possible scenario. When you say projecting the worst possible scenario, I say, yeah, that's related to fear, but it's a specific kind of fear. We could even, I think of several words that could go with that. You want to offer any?
collective sense, because I think that it's simpler for me in that regard.
Okay, so I'm gonna make some comments here. So I want to emphasize. Robert brought up this idea of projecting the worst possible scenario on what's external to us, outside of our body. I'm going to call it in the realm of social developments or possible future social developments, projecting the worst possible scenario into the future, into the current, whatever's currently going on, perhaps as well. So that's a great description. I'm just, inviting you guys to pick a label for that emotional pattern. But
well, like paranoia or panic?
I didn't projecting the word panic could be, but paranoia for sure. Does that make sense, Robert? Yeah, like the first thing I thought of was worry. So just worrying. So if I'm projecting the worst possible scenario, especially into the future, then that means I have some imagination or speculation about, or projection, whatever, about future events, and I'm creating anxiety. I'm experiencing anxiety and worry as a result of that particular focus on my future life. It's my life that I'm worrying about, right? Or that's typical, at least. So I want to contrast worry and paranoia with fright. So I'm driving down the road. We come to I see the light turn green, but then I enter the intersection. Then this other car comes, and I'm frightened, and we swerve, and we miss each other. Thank God. But all this adrenaline comes up. There's a bunch of fright. There's a bunch of fear. That kind of fear is a completely distinct thing than projecting the worst possible scenario all over the place. So I wouldn't say that everybody's paranoid, that's typical. So I don't agree with that in terms of being the answer to my basic original question. But I do think it's an important thing to be cautious about or to be aware of. So to contrast with actual paranoia, we can be aware of something and be cautious about it. So if I'm really investing in worry and paranoia, I can work myself eventually into a panic, potentially, based on totally my own interpretations that may have very little to do with anything remotely probable. That's an interesting thing, that people can actually worry themselves sick. That's a common saying, or somewhat common saying, but there's an element of truth to it. Dis-ease, meaning the absence of ease, stress, distress, worry. If somebody thinks, well, I got diagnosed with the following 3 conditions, and they think about their future, and the doctor said this, and I read that one thing, and my uncle who had that same thing, this happened to him, and people may worry about it and actually make themselves have an element of panic, where they're actually hyperventilating and short on breath and really anxious. And that is a linguistic, creative process that's completely distinct from the actual diagnostic label and so on. So is that all? Any comments on that or questions?
Actually, in the back of the Course in Miracles, there's what's called the supplements, and so it's kind of in alignment with that kind of idea, I think, to some degree, because big part of the Course is forgiveness, and that not from an ego perspective of, oh, I forgive JR for being the idiot that he is, or whatever, from kind of putting somebody else down to build up your ego so you feel better or feel above them because you've forgiven them for being something, whatever.
That they shouldn't be, right?
Yeah, and so Nichols was channeled supposedly by this Helen Schuckman, who was a psychiatrist. I believe she was atheist in belief and worked in a hospital. So it was about, clearing everything within you that you held as judgments or of being, victimized or having these challenges or having all these various things in you that was likely part of the reason that you were creating this disease or this fear or this panic, in your own reality. And it's about, kind of clearing those blocks of, the Course also in the beginning says that, most people believe that the opposite of love is fear, but what is all-encompassing can have no opposite, which tells me that, love has no opposite, and it's all-encompassing, so, fear is not the other side of that equation, and so I think from a perspective of all of the emotion of fear, it's about clearing everything out of the spirit and out of the mind in order to find that kind of, I think it was, you probably know this guy too, what was the book, guy lived in Mill Valley, one of our other teachers brings it up all the time. It's about clearing the blocks of the core essence of love. Is kind of the underlying theme there. I can't remember the name of the guy, so anyway.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Daniel, do you want to make any comment or raise any questions at this point?
No, I'm good.
Okay. I was going to turn back to you at this point and say, did you have a speculation on... Robert didn't hit the specific terminology that I had in mind as far as the most dominant emotion of the typical product of civilized life, public schools, mainstream media, etc. And I didn't mention churches, but certainly churches can contribute significantly to the prominence of that emotion that I haven't named. Do you have any speculation? Well, say more about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly, if you want to take away somebody's personal power or whatever, if you want to take away their confidence or you have to instill shame, right? You have to program the shame in to keep them from, getting into intelligent conversation, getting into conversations that might enlighten them. You instill that shame so that they don't even approach those conversations. I don't know. That's all I got.
Okay. And you didn't get that from reading any of my content specifically, right? Or did you?
No, I guessed that once you brought religion into it, then I knew what you meant, actually.
Okay.
That was a good clue.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I was like kind of attempting to provide some hints, right? Obviously. But shame is the word that I picked. And it's an interesting thing because most people would probably report that shame isn't a prominent part of their experience. However, I guess we could say a little bit more about what shame is. Robert, do you want to throw anything out there about like a paragraph or a sentence on what distinguishes shame from any other emotional flavor?
I don't know if I can make that.
You don't have to. I'm just
distinction,
requesting that you consider it, and if you say, I'll ask Daniel the same thing if you don't have anything.
Shame is a good one. And interestingly, I don't know that I really consciously became aware of it until like the last year or two.
Okay.
As far as tying it into what you're talking about there, I think it ranks up there with the negative emotion of fear, I guess.
Yeah, I would say that there's a few emotions that are extreme forms of fear, and shame is one of them. Terror and panic clearly have elements, they're fear-based emotions or types of fear, and shame has an element of fear, terror, panic, etc. But shame is similar to embarrassment, but it's not the same. It's similar to humiliation. It's not the same. It's similar to guilt. It's not the same. It's definitely similar to just fear in general, like anxiety kind of fear. Can you guys get that shame is related to anxiety?
It also is related to repression, very much so. If we're ashamed or we don't want to get into certain scenarios, we're going to repress maybe certain desires or certain things that we want to say. Right?
Okay, so we can repress desires. We can repress things that we might feel inclined to say, and when we repress them, that can be called shame. You want to say a little more about that, Daniel, or no?
Well, I mean, that's something I'm somewhat familiar with, so that's why I was able to, that's why I was focused on that, because that's, for me, shame is, has a correlation with repression.
Yeah. And we can think of examples of incidents or historical sequences either involving us or a famous movie or book or whatever. Something, I thought of one just now. A example of an instance of shaming or of shame. I just thought of an example. Anybody else want to throw something in before I do?
No.
Robert? No. Okay. There's a pretty famous book, I don't know, from the 19th century or 18th century possibly. It's called The Scarlet Letter. Are you guys either of you not familiar with it?
I've heard it, but I'm not familiar with it.
Okay. Daniel, are you familiar with it?
Well, I'm familiar with the idea of it, but I'm not. I didn't,
Give us the one paragraph version of what is the Scarlet Letter and what's it about.
Well, the only thing I really heard about it was about adultery, right? And then there was what do they do? Burn a letter onto you or something?
Just a scarlet red A was like sewn into their jacket or something like that.
Okay, that's
something
what it was.
like
Yeah, I knew that it was adultery, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The A was for adultery. And so are you familiar with the story?
No.
Okay. So one of the ironic elements of the story is that some woman who's unmarried becomes pregnant, I believe. I could have this wrong, but this is my recollection of it. She becomes pregnant. Everybody knows she's unmarried. Everybody knows she's pregnant. They give her this scarlet letter A, and the whole community, is ostracizing her. And I don't know if they throw stones at her or what the various humiliations and punishments and attacks that they perform. But the head of the community, from a kind of a social influence standpoint, is the minister. So it's like a Puritan or Protestant Massachusetts town, something like that. Like it probably is 18th century, maybe even 17th, but I think it's 18th. But it could be even like about, it may have been written in the 18th century about, the 16th or 17th century. Anyway, so the irony of the story, do you guys mind me giving away the irony of the story?
No.
The core irony of the story is that the minister is the father of the baby. So there's this, sequence of events where they're hiding, the the minister publicly has to shame the woman for adultery. I don't know if he's married to someone else or if he's an unmarried minister or what the detail of all that was, but I think that there's this basic thing of she bears the burden of all of the public shame, and I don't think he does, and it may be something like they both agree that the best thing is for him to, remain innocent in the public eye so that he can maintain his income and his position and secretly support the woman and the baby while he's, shouting at her in the the city center, and she's in shackles and bonds and they're hitting her with the whip or whatever. I don't know how extreme it got. I don't remember, but that's kind of the basic irony of it. So the action or the behavior that was shamed is sexual intercourse, and specifically unmarried or unauthorized sexual intercourse. Anybody you want to make a comment on that or throw out another example of shame?
Well, I don't know about an example of shame, but that certainly is a very classic example there. It's interesting that, it goes with the belief around the principle of monogamy, and, I'd be curious to know the evolution of that belief and concept, and how we've been conditioned. I mean, religion and guilt, I think guilt and shame kind of have some close proximity in emotion, and I guess it really goes back to that course lesson. Nothing has any meaning except for the meaning we give it, and we have some very ingrained concepts on this planet in the psyche of the human animal.
Mm-hmm. So Robert brings up guilt, and I would say guilt we recognize as being typically related to some action that someone actually did or is accused of actually doing. Like, not the absence of action, so usually, but some actual action. Shame is ultimately about being a social outcast, I would say. So there's a fear of punishment, there's a fear of being outcast, or there's the actual, being cast out of a society, somebody being kicked out of their home, or kicked out of their church, or those kind of things. If they have a professional licensing board and they get kicked out, I actually know a chiropractor who was on probation for getting a drunk driving ticket or whatever, and the licensing board put him on probation, and he could have lost his license just from getting a DUI, criminal charge or whatever. But he, after some number of years or months or whatever, he was removed from probation and just became a regular licensed chiropractor again with no probationary cautions on. But to be cast out of something valuable and important to our survival, like if you're a 6-year-old in a family and you get cast out of it, that's a pretty serious consequence. So to be an outcast within the context of some social setting, that's really what shame is all about, I would say. I do have some stuff written on shame, and that's part of what I was fishing for, whether Daniel had read it before, and apparently he hasn't. So I have something written that I wrote yesterday at 7 a.m., and I can begin to read through it a little bit, but I wanted to give everybody a chance to make any comments, or if you guys want to directly ask me anything or ask each other anything, now is a great time.
I think the brought up around the shame factor of that outcast or being outcast from the mainstream is based on this collective belief system of, you know, civilization and what's transpired over all the years to kind of conform to particular ways of being, ways, you know, belief systems, that's interesting. I really don't think I've really thought of the shame in that light before, but I mean, it does make sense to me that you know, that's part of the conformity, societal conditioning piece. That's interesting.
And as I had noted very early on, thank you, Robert. I have in mind to bring in at some point the idea of releasing shame, restoring a balance so that it's not as prominent as an emotion. Even to really recognize shame at all, it already starts to bring things into balance. I'll say that, I guess, is a very general statement. I'm not giving away any method at that point, but to recognize one's own experience of shame historically already starts to resolve shame, because one of the deals with shame is if you know about it, then that's not an intense shame. A really intense shame, people don't even know about. It's reflexive, you know. And we'll get to even some maybe why that would be. Daniel, do you want to comment on anything?
No, I mean, just to say that clearly you're saying if there's awareness of the shame, then you're going to be less reflexive. I mean, that's pretty logical, right?
Yeah, and even if you are reflexive, you can still be aware of it, and you know, there's no wrong time to bring awareness into the process. But the intensity of the reaction or the reflex, you know, there's a spectrum, and we'll come back to that in a bit. One of the things now that it's just three guys talking, and my wife is, you know, since before we started recording, she had stepped away, and when guys are talking, we can talk about things that we might not cover if there were 6-year-olds present, or if there were women present, or a variety of little, you know, modesties that we bring in, or I don't know what words, you know, out of respect, we don't say, you know, I don't know, we don't say pussy or something, right? So, or we don't call each other pussies when women or children are around. When they're gone, hey, we call each other pussies all the time as a kind of a casual, friendly, you know, joking kind of thing. Maybe not, but on the subject of adultery, I mentioned pussy, which obviously, you know, we can use it as a reference to a man who is perhaps relatively unable to defend himself. It's also, of course, a type of cat, and a reference to a female body part. So we're getting into you know, some of the classic points of reference of shame. So I'm ready to read a little bit, and you guys are welcome to interrupt at any point, and you can interrupt now if you want to interject anything. I'm going to talk about some of basically the classic sequence of shame from the perspective of a 1-year-old, 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old. As they get older, what are the social shames that they develop or learn? And they, meaning you and I and pretty much everybody else. Anybody in a civilized context is going to learn at least most of what I have in mind to mention. So I am reading something, and I'll just read it as I've written it, and you guys can interject and, you know, interrupt as you wish. And I'll probably ask you questions as we go at some point too. So the title that I've made is On Agonizing About How to Avoid or Prevent Shame. So agonizing is another word that we can identify as having an emotional component, right? So what is the best way to get away from a behavioral pattern of avoidance? Simply, you can't get away from avoidance. That would just be more avoidance. To attempt to get away from avoidance, or to simply stop all patterns of avoidance, will only perpetuate the pattern of identifying a particular thing as the thing to avoid and then ongoingly focusing on it, focusing on it, focusing on it, which is not avoiding it, it's focusing on it, right? So there's an irony present from the beginning. So interject at any point as you wish, as I said. Avoidance can be cautiously explored. If we avoid it, then we're doing it. But it can be cautiously explored consciously. It can be respected, like honored, like we can look at it as a potentially intelligent development. Like, why would anyone ever do that? Well, maybe there's a great reason for that. So we can also, in addition to exploring it and respecting it, we can potentially relax a reactive pattern of avoidance. And I am asserting, by the way, that shame has everything to do with avoidance. And Daniel had earlier mentioned repression. So that's all related stuff. So if avoidance is related to as something that no one ever should do, if we relate to avoidance as something that no one should ever do, then that is certainly not relaxation, but it's a state of chronic tension, a perpetuating of chronic tension to hold on to the idea tightly that no one, including me, should ever avoid. Avoidance is the wrong thing to do because no one should ever do it. We should avoid it. That is kind of the foundational irony that I begin this presentation with. So now we're ready to get into shame more specifically. And this is quite analytical. It's not like, you guys are going to have any sense of... I don't know if we're going to laugh as we go through this as far as like, I don't expect it to be that targeted to any of our actual emotional charges that we might have. But if so, that's fine. That's welcome. I do want to pause at this point. Any comments or questions? So likewise, in addition to the fact that to avoid avoidance is to practice avoidance, you can't compensate for shame so much that it dissolves. So if I start with this idea that something shouldn't be how it is, which is related to shame, I've got this idea, something shouldn't be how it is. What thing, whatever things, that's the issue of the shame, or the target of the shame, the object of the shame is whatever shouldn't be how it is. So you can't compensate for the idea that something shouldn't be how it is so much that idea that things should be how they are dissolves or dissipates. You can't compensate for the idea and make it dissipate. If you're trying to be good enough on top of a insistence or a commitment to the idea that I'm not good enough and that I'm trying to become good enough by doing good deeds, I can do lots and lots of good deeds and still have this underlying sense of I'm not good enough, and I have an original sin, an original shame, and there's, I've done all these good things, but I still feel unfulfilled. I still feel anxious, whatever it may be. So, is that clear?
Yeah.
So here's what you can do with shame. We mentioned with avoidance, we can explore it, we can respect it, we can relax it, or we can avoid it and ignore it, which is to generally perpetuate it. With shame, we can hide the shame, or we can feel the shame, and those are pretty much the two basic alternatives. There's might be a spectrum, and some stuff in between. But I'm just going to go with we can hide the shame, which perpetuates the shame, meaning to maintain it, or we can feel the shame, which will reliably resolve it. That is the only way to have the feeling of shame end, is to have the feeling of shame arise and be allowed to arise, and kind of, create a learning process to shift our attention and shift our physical experience. Certainly, there are physical experiences that correspond to shame, or some that can be associated with shame, like holding the breath and that kind of being startled and that scared. Gotta hold my breath. Gotta hold my tongue. Those kind of things. So I'm referring to two options in regard to shame: perpetuating it by hiding it, or resolving it by feeling it or expressing it. Further, when shame is hidden, there may be an unexpected compulsion to create new reasons to experience shame. This is a really important idea that we could take a big tangent on, but if you guys say, I totally get that, then we'll just move right on. Do you get, if there is a hiding of shame, then it's like a magnet for a compulsion to create new experiences of shame, to resolve that imbalance. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so I think I got 2 yeses. Anybody think of an example of that?
Well, I'm not sure I think of an example specifically of that, but I do kind of think that shame, this is from my experience, I think that shame was so deep inside my psyche that I wasn't even conscious of it. And
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah, so I think that kind of correlates with what you said just there.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and so that's a tricky thing. If we can create a sacred context, like a men's group where there's like or any support group where there's a specific confidentiality agreement and a specific structure, and people have the opportunity to report on their emotions, and they can check in and say, I'm feeling shame, then I don't even know why. I don't even know what about. I just really am present to the emotion of shame. That kind of thing is pretty unusual, but it can be really easy, and it can be really valuable, especially if there's some facilitation that's competently provided. A group can provide it. A one-on-one interaction can provide facilitation for resolving shame, and it doesn't need to be identified. We don't need to consider that we don't need to get what's the actual historical sequence. That's not necessarily important. The actual physical experience of shame and allowing that trembling or that breathing pattern, whatever corresponds to it, to allow it to arise could be sufficient. We don't necessarily need to figure it out. How do I fix the shame? How do I stop ever having shame? Those are counterproductive. How do I stop ever having shame is not really intelligent. Like, it's not really realistic about how shame works. Shame is something that can arise. Like, panic can arise, joy can arise, gratitude can arise. The idea of how should I completely repress the ability to experience any form of fear, that's really bad. I gave the example of, it's not practical. I gave the example of driving earlier, where it's useful to be able to see something frightening quickly and early, and to be able to make moderate adjustments so as to avoid a collision. The adrenaline and cortisol of fear are well-designed, hormones, and in modern civilized life, where people are driving a lot, where they're packed together in dense population groups, and where they're pumped with ideas of what to eat and what to think and what to worry about and so forth, it can be very challenging. So just to have a few days away from the normal conversations of shame and terror and paranoia, that alone can be a great relief and a healthy thing. If there's also a context for people to experience shame and reframe any current or historical sequences, that's a potential bonus that can be really awesome. And I'm making reference here to a scenario that's familiar to Robert because he and I have both participated in the Mankind Project's New Warrior Training Adventure weekend and ongoing weekly activities related to that group, in which people have the opportunity to identify their emotional state and explore it and experiment with the layers, because typically or in many cases there are layers of shame. So if I'm really pissed off at my wife for leaving the toothpaste tube without the cap on the toothpaste thing, if I'm really pissed off about that, it's kind of, I might even know, this is really weird that I'm so pissed off about that, but I am. And so I might be interested in exploring, what else is, what is back there with, the emotions that are rising up so prominently that I might get really curious. And if I have that context of relaxation and facilitation and safety and security, that's a reasonably good place to explore it. It might be really dumb to attempt to explore it, with my wife 2 minutes after I just got really pissed off at her about a trivial little thing, that I know is trivial, and it's just processing with your mate or processing with the other people that have been part of triggering me for a strong repulsive emotion like shame. That may be unrealistic. So, comments or questions? I have more. I'm just inviting comments at this stage. So I'll continue with reading. It may be obvious that shame is an extreme form of fear. In particular, shame is a subcategory of anxiety and paranoia. So if you think about what is paranoia and then do it even more, that's shame. What is anxiety? Do it even more, that's shame. So paranoia, the paranoia element is, I don't want to get caught. I don't want to have other people know, right? And that's really that's the anxiety element. So paranoia and anxiety are overlapping categories as well.
JR, wait a minute.
Go ahead.
Earlier, Robert said something about how emotion drives thoughts. Obviously, shame is strictly thought-based. So somebody can express shame, but not really feel it, though. There's nothing to really feel in shame. It's an expression. It's thought-based, right?
So is shame thought-based? Yes. I think you misquoted Robert, so I didn't know if Robert wants to comment on.
Okay, I misquoted him again. So you're right. Thoughts dictate emotion. Is that what you're saying? I mean, but doesn't it go both ways, though? Honestly.
I think it's perfectly valid to think of them as cyclic. That one, that you can get into like a spiral.
Yeah, because you can just, your body can kind of be feeling like shit one day, and that's might affect, what thoughts or what bothers you, or I'm sorry.
Yeah, if I haven't slept well, or if somebody wakes me up, when I'm really groggy or really irritable because of lack of sleep, then anything they say is going to be in that context, of my emotional state or my physiological state. So, I think, Robert, do you want to comment further on like how, maybe an example of how a thought feeds into an emotional experience?
Well, I think that this is my beliefs around emotion, and everybody has a different perspective. I'm not, he trained in emotional stuff, but I really believe that all emotions follow thought, and that if there's but I think a lot of times we might not be conscious of the thought, and a really dear brother in MKP told me early that a lot of times emotions kind of come out sideways from a past experience that we've had. I know, from my own experience there, that a lot of my anger came out directed at individuals that probably weren't the direct source of my initial anger to begin with, because I stuffed it down and didn't, process the emotion in a healthy manner.
Yeah,
So
I have a quick comment. We
Yeah.
we never direct anger at someone that we believe it's unsafe to direct anger at. So if we really feel threatened by somebody, we would never openly direct anger at them. We only
Right.
do it at people where we actually feel like that's safe to do, and if we find that we're wrong, then we stop doing it. If we find that it's not safe to direct anger at them, then we stop. Go ahead, Robert.
Yeah. So for me, I just believe that all of it comes from particular thoughts that we have, and gain a visceral experience from that thought or that experience that we've had. So that's just my own personal belief, in that equation. But I think that a lot of times we're not directly connected psychologically to the thought that we had that created this visceral or emotional or feeling within our bodies.
Okay. So I can give some examples of thoughts that create emotional consequences. I also like to give examples like driving in a scary, frightening driving situation. I'll talk about animals and the emotional experiences of animals, and animals don't have language skills, so they do interpret, but they don't actually label. At least most animals don't label, but they do have at least the basic set of emotions. They have cortisol and adrenaline and all these stress hormones, and testosterone, etc. So if I say, my wife left the lid off of the toothpaste, and that means that she is blah blah blah, and that means that I am screwed, and that means that blah 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 blah. And I have all these commentaries, and I don't know if story is the right word there, but if I have a commentary about witnessing that here's the cap and there's the toothpaste and they're not connected, I make some commentary, and that can build up an emotional charge. And it may be that I left the cap off the toothpaste, or that someone else, my mother-in-law did, or the 6-year-old did, or whatever. But there's a sequence of presumptions, and in many cases, somebody who's already stressed, they presume, back to Robert's reference way back, if someone's stressed, it's actually adaptive to presume the worst, to project the worst. Because if I'm like super, tired, then safety would imply that I am super conservative, so that I'm super cautious. And if that means that I see the tube of toothpaste off of the cap, then I think, well, my wife wants to kill me, or my wife is going to leave me, or whatever, like really weird thing. But it actually makes sense that we could have that kind of a projection. But in the examples I'm giving, I'm hoping to be ridiculously extreme, where anybody would say, yeah, the cap of toothpaste thing, that's like, how is that related to someone leaving you, or how is that related to she doesn't love you, or any of those kind of things. And why is somebody even concerned about that is another background question I don't intend to get into. But there has to be anxiety in the background, and anxiety or worry for sure involves thoughts. So Daniel, this was all generally intended to be responsive to the items that you raised. Do you have any further question or comment on what Robert and I have said?
No, I appreciate both of your answers and your words, and it's given me a lot to think about. Yes.
Okay. Robert, did you want to add anything before I go back to my script?
No.
Okay. Okay, so I have also the next thing I mentioned. I was just talking about shame as a subcategory of anxiety and fear and paranoia. I also say here, anger and sadness I also consider forms of fear. So I'm never angry unless there's fear, and then I'm outwardly pushing away something that I'm afraid of. Sadness is a fear about the future, and I'm just going to kind of assert that, and if you guys want me to say more, I could, but when a toddler or infant cries, like screams, it's because they're afraid. So you go over to the infant or the toddler that's crying and say, "Oh, Johnny, what's wrong?" And they say, "Sally scared me. She yelled," or whatever they say. They're inviting comfort. I'm sad. I'm scared, and I'm sad is actually a little bit distinct. But if somebody's been, say that my dog dies, which I actually had a dog die in my maybe middle school years in the early '80s. So I have that grief for that loss. That's a sadness. That still is a kind of fear. So I'm going to put this back to you guys. If my dog dies and I'm really grieving and I'm crying and I'm sad and maybe I'm screaming even, what am I afraid of?
The future.
Okay, that's correct. Do you want to be more specific?
Well, a future without the dog, I guess.
Yeah, keep going. More specific.
Without love.
Okay, without love. So if I was experiencing the dog as a ally and a source of love, and even that I love the dog and as a receiver of my love, and that dog dies, and then I look at the future and I think, oh, I will never love again. Okay, you don't say that about a dog, but you'd say that about breakups and relationships, and and I'm pretty sure each of us have said something like that, and we know that we have experienced love after we said, I will never love again. Well, we were wrong. But we were sincerely afraid that that it would be challenging to recreate the positive experience. So we're anticipating a future absence, an ongoing absence of a positive thing. That's sadness. So I didn't intend to really get into that, but anybody want to comment or question about that real quick?
No.
And sadness is related to shame. So you've got that fear aspect of shame for sure. Anxiety, paranoia. I don't want to get punished. I don't want to be cast out. But there's also that sadness element in many cases with shame, or we could say a regret element. So in many cases, somebody did something or something happened. So there's at least regret. Maybe not sadness projected in the future, but like regret. So here's a few very common forms of shame. The number one earliest thing in the average life of the average human is shame regarding the exposure of genitals, or that's certainly one of the early ones. I can also think of to be potty trained, basically. So, to have feces, or just to piss themselves, or to pee in bed while they're sleeping. A 6-year-old boy or whatever may occasionally or frequently pee in bed. Those are things that are not unusual for people to experience shame about if they have that situation arise. But almost universal is just the exposure of genitals in general, and in the case of I think of this as more the case of little boys than little girls, but a 2-year-old just doesn't care, and you can tell them all day up and down to wear clothes, and they're not really probably going to be conscientious about that. A 3-year-old or maybe 4-year-old, at some point they're like, oh, you know what? If I take off my clothes, I get attention. And I think of that as more with boys. And they may parade their nakedness once they realize that it gets attention of adults and so on. But that doesn't go on for decades. You don't typically, in our society, you don't see that in 14-year-olds, in 44-year-olds. We don't go around parading and trying to attract attention in general public common settings. We're in the living room and suddenly we pull down our pants or something. That's, hey, look at me. Look at what I've got. Like, that's not normal. Maybe at the age of 3 there's a little bit of normalcy to that kind of thing, but that starts to be really disruptive, and it's really going to be shamed. It's going to be there's going to be some intervention. Somebody may not even say, do not ever do that. They may say, come here, young man, you are blah 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 blah. You go to your other room, you put your clothes on, you stay in there, and you don't come out. And you think about what you've done, and they don't, maybe they don't even say anything further. But there's some kind of intervention typically, right? Or they're put in jail, or whatever it is. But y'all guys got that, right?
Yeah.
So the exposure of genitals is huge, and it's really like, around the time that they're done potty training, and then getting into, once they're in larger social settings, mostly, like primitive people and the average mom or whatever, they don't care at home. But once they know that they're going to take their child to a nursery school or any other setting where there's a context where the genitals of the kid is not going to be okay, or is anticipated is not going to be okay, then the parent's going to start accustoming the child to always covering. You always close the door when you're in the bathroom. Why should I close the door in the bathroom? You just get in the practice of closing the door when you go to pee. Okay? And so, we go into like the military or whatever, any number of instances where a bunch of people together can be naked, but it's not one person being naked, right? Typically. And I'm there's obviously exceptions to what I'm talking about in terms of like, what is that called? Chippendales, stripping and stuff. But on the whole, the adults will train a child to keep covered or keep hidden, keep out of public view if you're not wearing any pants or anything below the waist, whatever, any cover, a towel, whatever. So the next shame is I can comment on this one a little bit as far as a personal example. The next, because I don't remember like learning about when I was trained not to go in public without clothes, but the next shame is sexual arousal, and this may be more so for men than for women. I'm not really sure, but with men, there's the obvious erection of the genital, the penis. So there can be a shame regarding sexual arousal, and I think I'll go through my short list and then come back to my example. There are also shames relating to a fear of punishment. So something was not done and I expect punishment, or something was done and I expect punishment, or something was accused of having been done and I'm concerned about future punishment. So shame and secrecy, we can think of secrecy as related. Shame can be related to a fear of punishment. I have here fear of rejection. So I don't want to ask the girl out because she might reject me. That's that's shame, or I'm counting that as related to shame. I don't want to call my client and say, you're $170 past due. When can you have the check for me? Because I don't want them to say, I'm not going to pay you, or whatever the fear is. I'm making it up. That's why I paused. But a fear of condemnation can be related to shame. Fear of the display of fear. I don't know if I'm going to comment on that in depth, but if I'm scared and I'm in a public setting, like a bunch of people, and I display fear, and other people, think about a playground in like elementary school. If I'm weak and I'm hurt and I'm, afraid, maybe not just an immediate hurt that people will have compassion for and so on, but there are cases where someone's like getting intimidated or bullied, and they want to withhold the display or block the display of fear, and they can be ashamed because they feel fear, but they don't want anybody to know. If I feel something and I don't want anybody to know, that's shame. If I think something and I don't want anybody to know, that's shame. And the last one is also very common, the fear of being observed while crying. So it's not the fear of crying, it's fear of being observed while crying. That is another common shame. So anybody want to comment on any of that or question? I do have an example to give. Anything you guys want to put in first?
Nope.
Daniel?
Nope.
Okay. So the sexual arousal thing. All right. So in high school, 9th or 10th grade, I would say 9th grade, geometry class, Mrs. Wills was the teacher. So we've got, in public schools, we've got mixed sex. Lots of kids, maybe 30 in the classroom. They're relatively tightly, seated. They'll have you line up at times in, elementary school or in gym class or whatever. You line up in a typical classroom. You have kind of a rows and columns or whatever of desks, and you have your seat, or you find your seat, whether it's assigned or what. Everybody has their seats, and there's all these other people, and some of them are female, and a male who's 14, and he smells the smells, perfumes or other smells like pheromones. Do you guys know what pheromones are? Daniel?
Yes.
Okay. So there's like these sexual signals that the women are putting out that they're fertile. The men can't help but on some level experience that. So you got a room packed full of all these pheromones, perfumes, visuals. I'm from North Florida, is where I was raised, so at certain times of the year you can expect the young ladies in the classroom to have a pretty significant amount of skin exposed. Some of them are healthy and young and attractive. Some of them perhaps less so, but even to see a face, they put on makeup, they do their hair, and then you hear them talk. You see them move. They're just walking by. I'm trying not to look, but I know that they're there. So we're in the midst of this, soup of hormones, really powerful hormones. My hormones, the other guys, the women. Obviously, there's a teacher, but the peer group. You've got all these young women just come into fertility, or in that process, and you've got all these young men, and the young men typically are going to have a competitive experience of the other men because they want to impress the women. That's not unusual. It might not be universal, but I think it is universal. It's just that some people are so shy about it, or so unskilled at it, that they don't necessarily bother with it. But some guys are flirting. They're making girls laugh. They're enjoying the girls and all that stuff. But then the bell rings, and you've got to just stop. And the guy who's having a great time and then gets interrupted by the bell, wow, that's actually, frustrating, potentially. So, I didn't really give my actual example yet. So you guys got the context.
Yep.
And I assume you guys have had similar experiences to the kind of thing I just mentioned, in your own schools and so on.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Been on both sides, yeah.
What do you mean both sides?
Well, I've been the guy talking to the girl, and I've been the guy that's not saying a word.
Oh, I got it. Yes. Yeah, and then there's also girls are talking to us. How do we avoid that? If there's, we're in class and this cute girl is I can actually name a girl. I'm not gonna because she's a Facebook friend of mine currently, but in case this would ever, somebody would ever, or other people would know her. But I remember a young lady, my same grade level in high school, who kind of unbuttoned her like a, I don't know just a button down shirt, whatever you call that. And she had it unbuttoned a little bit already, and she unbuttoned it more and was sitting at me and kind of like opened it at an angle where her bra, one of her breasts, including the bra, was like very visible, and she like grabbed my I can say this much, it was my English class, and she grabbed my little white English book and put it against her face and made a lip kiss thing on my book. Like this all happened in a few moments, that she was kind of like stripping for me. And I don't know that I fucking did a thing to bring this on. I have no recollection of me encouraging this or any of that. It might have been during class too. Like she's actually doing it as an expression of her power, and she's bored in class, and here's this guy, and she's gonna flirt with him, and she has no intention, as far as I know, of anything beyond teasing, but that's the kind of thing that happened on occasion, or that was a rare thing. So that's still not the example I was going to give, but I'll pause there if anybody wants to comment.
Yep.
So 14-year-old boy, you're packed in the classroom, you've just gotten certain, hormonal things going on for you, your puberty's taken off, etc. You have a chest hair 3 or whatever the situation is. Geometry class, for me, I remember very well, was a class where I got erections. I have no idea why. There was no specific stimulus that I'm aware of for why I would get an erection, but I got an erection, and the bell rings, and it's time to go from one class to the other. You've got to walk around in the hallways now, and I'm wearing shorts, or even if I'm wearing jeans, a pretty good erection is conspicuous, right? So that was an embarrassing situation.
So I was in class and I had an erection, and then the bell rings and it's time to go from one class to the other. So I have some folders or books or whatever. Hopefully, if I have no books or folders with me, wow, that's an interesting situation. But I've got to get up and, generally I had like a backpack or a book or a folder or whatever, and I'd make a point to carry it right in front of me to cover up that visually obvious situation. And to the best of my knowledge, no one ever saw that. But if I was in, gym class or something, and everybody's, changing clothes or whatever, I think it might have been relatively, innocuous. But the bigger concern I had, I think, was being seen by women. So one possibility is that it's not that big a deal, but the idea that humans are sexual is,
obvious, but it's also an idea that's like disruptive to certain social contexts, job sites, school systems, and so on. So we have this idea of the Garden of Eden and the noticing of nakedness and then shame, which is called I guess that's related to the saying original sin, but I'm not going to get into that right now. The idea of one person looking at another person and feeling shame is actually feeling aroused and feeling attracted, but being afraid of taking action on it. So can you guys get that detail?
Yes.
So if I'm naked and somebody else is naked, I'm attracted, and then we start making out and blah 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 blah. There's no shame about the nakedness. I have no problem being naked, in a certain situation. But public nakedness with lots of people looking, or if my grandma sees me naked or whatever, maybe maybe not. But some people would be embarrassed. It's certainly at a certain age, some people would be embarrassed about that. I remember my sister that I was raised with is 4 years older than me, and so at a certain age, she and I could take baths together. But then as time went on, I didn't care, but she didn't want to take a bath with me, probably because she was, modest about her nudity. So, let's see. All of that to me is kind of like things we already know this stuff. It's just we don't necessarily comment on it very often. But to me, sexuality and the power of reproduction and the idea of competing for mates is a important factor in the background of a lot of kinds of shame. Even things like being, outcast from a family. Well, why is family so important? Because it doesn't have to be that family is important. But if family, if I'm interested in extended families and I want to mate and reproduce and I want to have the grandparents involved and all that, then it's definitely a big deal to be an outcast from the family, just as it would be a big deal to be 3,000 miles away from the rest of the family. So I'm just bringing these up as kind of practical things, not necessarily of huge importance, but I thought I'd touch on them quickly. Any comments or questions on any of that?
Nope.
Okay, so this is an interesting one. I'm reading my notes here. There's also a shame involving the fear of being punished because of another person feeling shame. So somebody else feels shame, and I'm there, or I'm aware of it, and I could be afraid of being punished because of their shame. So I could say more about that, but is that instantly clear or not? That's a no. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
No, yeah, I don't know. Give me an example.
Okay, so I have some questions prepared, conveniently. Questions like, how could I have prevented it? Oh my God, this is horrible. They shouldn't ever feel shame. How could I have prevented it? And I'm concerned that somebody else is going to say, why didn't you prevent it? And they're, that kind of thing. The next question, shouldn't I have done more? They felt shame. Well, shouldn't I have done more? So if I'm concerned about if I'm concerned about other people feeling shame with, paranoia, then there's this latent guilt. How could I have prevented it? Could I have prevented it? Shouldn't I have done more? What should I have done different? Next time, what should I do different? That can all be labeled as shameful agonizing. So is that clear generally?
Yes.
So in a recent call, someone talked about their child hitting their head and crying, and a conversation related to that. And one of the kinds of questions that we heard from that was, shouldn't I have done more? Did I do the right thing? Now, that doesn't have to be shame, but can you see how that kind of agonizing, well, first of all, can you see how that's agonizing? Or how it could be. Because it could be just a curiosity of like, in fact, the way that that person presented it was almost just a straight curiosity, but I think there was a little element of agonizing or shame in the background. In fact, I think I wrote that down on my notes. But it's possible for somebody to say, how could I support you? Or how could I have handled that better? I'm curious. You know, there could be a curious kind of context. It doesn't have to be shameful if somebody asks that question. But often people don't actually ask those questions out loud, but they're asking them internally. They're thinking, how could I prevent it? And they're running through scenarios, and they're really agonizing a lot, and there's a shame in the background that this should not have happened, and I should not have let it happen. And what can I do in the future to make sure that the wrong thing doesn't ever happen? And there's a fear of the future. And that's an element of shame that we haven't necessarily mentioned a lot, but there's a fear of the future. There's some kind of future thing. So if I get seen with an erection as I'm walking down the hallway in high school, I may not get anything said to me that day, but is somebody going to taunt me a week later or a day later or an hour later? Are they going to say something, you know, make a reference to that that's going to be shaming me? So there's all sorts of concerns that people can have. Go ahead.
So it's actually a fear of the past that we're projecting into the future,
well,
if you want to use those terms. Yes.
Well, we're fearing our imagination about the future, which is all
Yeah.
you know, is related to the past for sure.
Right. Gotcha.
Yeah. Yeah, and another thing is, I'm not just in case you guys aren't aware of this, I'm not anti-shame. I'm not anti-fear. I think it's sometimes an accurate thing for somebody to go, wow, I should put a folder over my middle of my body here to avoid complications and disruptions to my social life. That's a good choice, and I'm going to go with that. And I'm really concerned that if I don't do that, that somebody's going to draw attention to it, or that it's going to, it's just easier to have that concern. Just like it's easier to wear clothes when you're 4 years old, you start wearing clothes regularly. Fine, you don't even it's summertime and it's hot, but if I go outside, if I go out of my house, I'm going to take clothes with me and I'm going to wear them as I go. And that's just a typical thing. At some age, that's how people are. At some age, 2 or whatever, I think of the issue with the 2-year-old is people don't want them just peeing, on the sofa or whatever. They don't want them pooping. They're concerned about defecation and urination, but which are also, shameful, horrible things, hypothetically. But the mere act of nudity isn't a big deal for a really little kid, I guess because kids of that age just almost nobody gets aroused by seeing a 2-year-old naked, So if 6-year-olds being naked arouses anybody, so be it. But it's a kind of an interesting question because it doesn't make a lot of sense that would necessarily be true. I think it's just that it's distracting for one person to be naked, and it's like one of the things that we learn is not to draw attention to ourselves, or not to draw too much attention to ourselves in the wrong way. So again, I'm picking age 4. By age 4, we do not go out naked. Or if we go to the beach and it's a nude beach, or if we go to the beach and we're 4, then it's a setting like a swimming pool or certain things where there's a little more looseness to it. But you don't go to the grocery store naked when you're 4, So you guys got the idea there, I believe. Any comments, feel free to make them. So, I have more to say. Go ahead. Go ahead, Daniel.
Never allow yourself to be naked. And
Never,
you're not even-
ever. Yeah, it's a
No,
problem.
No, you're not even. You're metaphorically speaking. Yes, I mean we can apply that to many aspects.
Yeah, not just physical nudity, but like
Wow,
exposing
yeah,
your
yeah.
ideas and your emotions, right?
Yeah. Gotcha.
Yeah. And it is also, true that I think maybe one of the issues with like little kids, kids do get, like boys at least, they get erections like when they need to pee or whatever the situation is. They'll masturbate or whatever, however much they do. There's all sorts of issues that could be background factors. So a 4-year-old masturbating at the beach is not so good, but a 4-year-old naked at the beach, yeah, that's fine. Nobody cares. So we have to be trained by adults and people who know what's appropriate and what's inappropriate, because 4-year-olds wouldn't know. Like, we don't know. People glare at us or make a comment, and then we figure out, oh wait, I'm in trouble. I need to stop, blah blah blah. And I need to figure out what I'm doing wrong or what I need to do right or whatever. And that's a learning process, and it's adaptive, and it makes sense. And we can carry some pretty heavy shames, out of high school and into adulthood and into life contexts where we don't have the social pressures of the high school classroom, but we still operate in that chronic tension pattern. That's getting to, kind of where I'm ultimately interested in going. I still have 4 paragraphs left of reading. I will go to the next one. What is the best way to get away from agonizing? I need to know, and I need to know now. Yesterday even. If agonizing is defined as questioning the best way to avoid something. So agonizing could be defined as questioning what is the best way to avoid blank something, right? So if agonizing is defined as questioning the best way to avoid something, then asking how to avoid agonizing is ironic. It's a continuing activity of agonizing. If I'm, in a panic of wondering how to avoid agonizing, how to never agonize, how to prevent my spouse from ever agonizing, and ever crying and ever feeling fear and ever da-da-da, and we want fear's negative and agonizing is negative and we never want to da-da, and how do I figure out how to stop doing it, and how do I figure out how to prevent it from ever happening in the future, how do I save the world from agonizing, how do I save the world from fear, and all those kinds of questions. I was demonstrating with my voice that approach towards hyperventilation and panic or anxiety attack, we might call it that. Comments or questions? Okay, third to last paragraph. Those who are operating in shame are also known to demonstrate an unconscious pattern, or at least initially unconscious pattern, of shaming others. So people operating in shame have a tendency to shame others, and even without knowing it, unconsciously. So that could be ridicule, vilification, antagonism. Passive aggression is a great example because, I didn't write that down, but it's a great example because sometimes people are really aware of their passive aggression because it's like extreme and obvious and they're making a point of it. Other times, if you consider a 6-year-old or whatever, there's passive aggression that it takes a little reflection to recognize, for the person doing it. They might be able to easily recognize it upon reflection, but they're just, they're operating in a mild panic. Shame is related to panic, oddly enough. Or it's really like, if you want to put it this way, shame is all about avoiding a future panic. That's what's really, really going on. Does that make sense? I could be oversimplifying, but does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So, for those who have a relative absence of self-respect and quiet confidence, arrogance is typical. So the absence of self-respect and quiet confidence, if they have shame, they're going to blame somebody. They're going to be arrogant. They're going to ridicule people. They'll be egotistical. They'll be vindictive. They'll be resentful. You can't have resentment without a background of shame. Something happened that shouldn't have happened, and I blame them for it, or I blame those people. Shame is that core thing of that should not have happened. So to really relate to something like it should not have happened, that is shame. Do you get how that fits?
Yeah, and I get how many people are stuck in that mindset or that way of seeing things. Yes.
Yeah, we're even programmed by media and schools and churches, et cetera, et cetera. Here's the list of things that shouldn't be. And that includes, you shouldn't be naked in public or whatever, kind of easy, practical things that we can even understand why that's a norm. But
Divorce, poverty, all these different things that you should be ashamed.
there shouldn't be cruelty, there shouldn't be war, there shouldn't be lying, there shouldn't be death, So mortality shouldn't be how it is. So there's all or illness or whatever there is. So or symptoms. So there's all sorts of things that we can relate to as something that shouldn't be. We need to end it as quickly as possible, and those are subject of shames. And typically universally we learn shames. They're all social. None of them are personal. There is no personal shame anywhere. It's all a social program, and different societies will have different programs or different things that are shameful. A society can change what's shameful, like gay marriage or homosexuality can be shameful. In 1993, it's shameful unless you're in San Francisco, or New York City. But in 2003, it's reasonably accepted unless you're in Kansas or whatever. So there's this ongoing shift of what is shameful and what's not. Racism is shameful. Sexism is shameful. There's a variety of things that come and go in terms of the intensity of what is the priority thing that should not be ever. People shouldn't argue. People shouldn't get divorced. I think that's a great example. Is people should not get divorced. And again, historically, if we were to research it from an anthropology standpoint, we could totally see why that developed. Someone brought up monogamy before. I think it was Robert. We can see why regulations and rules and norms developed. If we study those things, which may not be interesting to us, but if we study them, every frickin' norm has a reason. Some of the reasons are really illogical or really thin or even hysterical, but there's always a logic. It's just not very, sound in some cases. So people should be ashamed of their ancestry, if you were, ever convicted of a crime, if you were caught speeding. It's fine to speed, but if you get caught, then you should be ashamed. I don't know, I'm making this up. Anybody want to make a comment on an example of shame from their own personal history or anything you want to throw in at this point?
That's funny, JR. I got a court date Thursday for a ticket.
Oh, I think you had told me that before, though. I already knew that from last time we talked. You told me about that, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things there is where we can experience that high degree of concern, like anxiety, about how's it going to go. And I should win this case. And there can be this sense of, I need to beat the system and show them and show my skill at, how to put cops in their place and put the judge in their place. And we can go in with that kind of attitude, like a chip on the shoulder kind of attitude. And in that case, we're taking shame with us, and we're going in to kind of compensate and be heroic and stuff. That's not as effective as going in aware that it could go poorly or well, and being really relaxed, and then really being cautious and listening closely and being conservative and looking for where is there a joke and where is there a pretense and where is there an irony, because I believe that people can find favorable results in legal settings by being relaxed and intelligent and assertive. You know, there's a combination of things that you have to have all of them together. Just being assertive without being relaxed, that can go very poorly. So that's based on some experience, by the way. You want to comment, anybody? Robert first.
Yeah, I believe in honor, dishonor, and
Yeah.
proceeding as you would honor any other human being. Not give them any just authority in my life.
Right. Yeah, and you go into a courtroom, you don't think I'm going into a religious ritual, but you might not think that, but you could think that. You could think, what's going on with this, this whole process? And there are loopholes. There are things where the judge is attempting to they're inviting someone into a submissive role from early on. Like, you're familiar with this, Robert, from your own past experience, right?
Yeah.
Daniel, do you want to comment on any of what we just covered, or some historic shame that you want to mention?
Well, no, I've never really been in front of a judge, but
Okay.
I can imagine that as we deal with shame in our life, it would be a better idea to honor honor others instead of dishonor them. I can get that principle.
Okay, let's take a little diversion here. Robert, will you say a little more about honor and dishonor as it relates to communications and the court ritual?
I'm not going in there to create conflict or controversy. I'm going in there to that's, I guess, understand, what's been a problem, or what's the claim, and why I'm even there.
Right. So you're there to raise questions and to give the other party an opportunity to address your questions.
Yep.
If they ask you questions, you could say, well, could you clarify what you mean by blah, blah, blah? And are you presuming that I am blah, 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 blah when you say that? Because it sounds to me like you're trying to get me to agree that I am the defendant, or that I am guilty, or that I am subject to those laws, or that the jurisdiction does apply, or whatever. And there's all these legal things, and I don't want to get into the details of the terminology, but Robert knows what I'm talking about, and I think Daniel pretty much knows everything I just mentioned, at least generally. So, honor does mean if somebody makes a statement or an assertion, to recognize it and acknowledge it can be important, and if someone makes an assertion, especially a judge, and I do not contradict them or question them, then legally I just agreed with them, or that's how the ritual goes. It's called acquiescence. Are you familiar with that term, Daniel?
No.
Okay.
But I get what it means, though. Yes.
Yeah, so it's just an implicit agreement, more or less. Implied consent. So, of course, the courts are making duress. I remember when I was last in court for which was for a driving thing, the judge said something like, now you have to, in order for you to do this plea bargain or whatever it was, this payment arrangement, you have to agree that you didn't do it under duress, and that there was no, there was no threat in the matter. And I'm thinking, okay, well, you're saying if I don't do that, then you're going to arrest me if I don't agree to this right now, but I have to say that there's no duress. And I'm pretty sure I just said no, I'm not under, nobody put me under duress and blah, blah, because I was just like, I wanted to, I was there with the particular issue in mind of a warrant, and I wanted to leave with the warrant being complete or have it be handled. You know, like I know if I pay $300 in the next 3 weeks, then it's done. I wanted that to be done, 100% done, and I didn't want to risk anything else. So I believe legally that I agreed to pay him like $1,500 further eventually. No installment plan, no specific time frame. Just I agree I owe you that other amount. If you'll, if you don't put me in jail today, then I'll agree that I owe you the other amount. And that's how it ended. I had said a minute ago, or a few minutes ago, Daniel, did you want to make note of any historic instance of shame? You could say no, certainly, but just would you like to mention anything that comes to mind that you'd like to share about a present or past shame?
Oh, yeah, my last relationship, I guess, and just, how it progressed to, we just continued to shame each other. That's kind of what it progressed to, and how much that hurt, and how long that hurt lasted. So it was, and then how much blame, how much resentment that I held for so long, and I still maybe have some of that, but I see it now. So yeah, is that the past shame you meant, or there could be other past shame? And
I wasn't fishing for a particular example. I am aware of that case, but that's perfect. It's also consistent with some of my own experience, as I think you know. Robert, I don't know if you want to mention in passing. I mean, I know some of your personal history as far as relationships and so on. Do you want to mention anything? We don't need to, but do you want to now? Have you ever experienced a challenging breakup where shame was involved?
Sure, that's when you talked me into, or opened the door. You didn't talk me into. You opened the door to MKB was when I was going through a divorce, and
Yeah.
certainly the shame that I felt was, not being able to hold up my end from a financial, perceived obligation, I guess.
Right. Yep. Yeah, I remember all that. What was that? 2000, end of 2005, right?
Yep.
Go ahead, Daniel.
I'm sorry, I just totally relate to what you just said. Yeah, that's in the situation I was mentioning, that was part of it anyway.
Yeah, and if I was thinking of my relationship that ended, it ended the beginning of 2001, but it was in 2000 that I started to make some ultimatums, and I saw that if I had an extra $20,000 and wanted to continue the relationship, it could have continued. I don't know that I would have necessarily wanted to. I think ideally I would have, but I don't know that. I can't really comment on it. I'm not going to speculate about it retroactively, but there was definitely many relationships I've been in as far as cohabitation and so on. There's been, even with my marriage, there are periods of time where there's relative abundance financially, and periods of time where there's we got a return check charge or something the other day from Cox, our crappy internet provider, our wonderful internet provider, and so there was we put the money into the account. They had like an automated payment, and we didn't have the money in the account that day, so it ended up that there was a fee. And I called them up and I just said, hey, can you reverse the fee? And they said, yeah, I think so. We'll put in that request, and I'm pretty sure that'll be credited, within, it could take 72 hours or a week or whatever they said. But it's interesting to me, too, because I have a degree of, I have an element of concern where I want to be really conservative about finances, perhaps in part because of some of my history of problems, and also what I anticipate in the future as far as my financial forecasts. I like the idea of having several months, several years of living expenses available to me. Some of it in the building, you know, in my office or in whatever, you know, my wallet, whatever. Some of it in one bank, a little bit more in another bank. I like it to be spread around, you know, just in case anything happens with one account or one bank or anything like that. I hate it when the internet goes out, but I'm aware that with electronics and with you know, debit cards and all these things, like we live in a really complex society, and I don't want to be 48 hours waiting for access to my basic living expense money. You know, there's some things that I'm fine with saying I can wait a week for that, but some things I want to have like a basic amount of cushion financially that is immediately available to me, either in the next room, or I got a few different accounts with money, which I like. Even if it's $100, I like having a couple places where I've got enough for a taxi ride or whatever, you know. So I don't know the last time I really had to use money in an emergency, if ever, but I like the idea of having it available. So I actually didn't finish reading my thing. We've gotten to some really rich and you know, neat little side tangents here. I got two more comments, and these get a little bit political, but not intensely or controversially. Not with you guys, at least. So there may be a desperate sense of craving for the approval of the crowd or the authority. Even we want explicit approval, like really, really clear approval. We want frequent approval, like we need it several times a day or several times a week. Or maybe from our partner, if it's a romantic situation, we want approval really, you know, reassurance over and over, really frequently. And that is a normal human experience, maybe for a teenager more so than a mature adult. But the approval of the crowd or the approval of the authority, well, in some cases that's really intelligent. In other cases, we could probably agree that some people are hysterical, paranoid, you know, doing themselves a disservice or something like that by the degree, the intensity of their anxiety. Unfamiliar ideas. So this is like when I'm ashamed, there can be a desperate sense of craving because I want approval, because I don't want anybody to condemn me. I want that constant approval so that I don't have to face my own shame. I don't want to be left alone. I don't want to be condemned or criticized. I don't want to be exposed that I'm afraid. If I'm ashamed, unfamiliar ideas may be dismissed as unimportant. Just reactively, reflexively dismissed as unimportant unless they're endorsed by an institutional authority, whichever institution I consider valid and credible or whatever one I'm loyal to. If one of those institutions doesn't endorse something, then I reflexively may dismiss it as, well, it's not important to me. Those institutions tell me what's important to me, and if they don't tell me about blah blah blah, then blah 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 obviously isn't what's important to me, because they tell me what's important to me. In regard to the sacred propaganda dogmas of the particular holy authority, questions are not welcome. If someone is ashamed, they do not pursue their own questions or doubts, and they do not want to hear others. If they hear, it's like a cult setting. If somebody is sensitive to questions about the dogma, then they don't want anybody else to know that they're sensitive to them. They don't want to hear it. They literally don't want to see worry, or they don't want to see fear, or they don't want to see shame, or they don't want to see anger, because those things shouldn't be. And we gotta shame people into suppressing fear and anger and all these things. And again, there are contexts where that makes sense, and there are other contexts where at least I can't see how it makes sense for that specific circumstance, but I see people with really strong panic kinds of reaction to suppress questions, to distract people from raising questions, or to dominate which questions are raised and how they're raised. I'm assuming everybody's generally familiar with what I'm talking about and probably could give examples of conversations and so on. Is this landing really, really obvious for you guys? Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. In fact, below average enthusiasm for the familiar presumption of the sacred institution and so on is likely to result in a panic of hysterical condemnation. So if I perceive other people to have below average or insufficient enthusiasm, that itself will result in me testing them with an accusation if I'm ashamed, is the idea. So accusations are not made from, or not just from sincerity and reflection and like gathering evidence first and all that, but simply as a test to see how people will respond. If someone seems scared in response to a threatening accusation, then a person who's in that conservative, like, I don't want to study this mode, I don't want to study this extensively. If they're in a mode like that, they want to get a quick conclusion. Okay, somebody seems scared, I'm going to just dismiss them. I'm going to interpret them as untrustworthy, as guilty, as ashamed, and I want to see, are people going to be ashamed if I accuse them? Oh, that person's ashamed. That's good to know. And in some cases, again, particularly when you have one or a group of people who are ashamed, if they find someone else ashamed, they may congregate, concentrate, target, escalate, swarm, attack, destroy. Like, can you get that as a reality across humans and other animals, that kind of thing can happen? I don't know how clear what I said was to you, so tell me. So do you get how people can make accusations, and then depending on how the accusation responded to, they may come in really hard with a group of aggressive, we're not just going to cast you out of the group, we're literally going to kill you, even as an extreme. You get how that can work?
Yes.
Okay. And so there's a panic. Shame has an element of panic, and it's a panic about the future, but it's a very suppressed panic. So that's all that I had as a script to read. What are some other comments you guys have about the whole thing we covered, or wherever you're at right now? What else?
Well, I guess one place where I'm at is ready to kind of turn in a little bit here.
Yeah.
But I guess kind of some final thoughts around that. In regards to shame, I think that's where things go back to, for me, like a self-forgiveness of, doing the best that I knew at the time,
Mm-hmm.
and becoming conscious of something is kind of the first ticket to kind of healing from whatever shame you've experienced or I've experienced in my life, and so I think it certainly inspires me to kind of look at it a little bit closer. Interestingly, I've had conversations with my current love relationship along the lines of shame, and it's been very helpful and healthy. We've both expressed, that emotion in our life, and I think it I don't want to say begs, but it definitely interests me in releasing any shame that I have, you know, from past experience, and kind of opening up and freeing the energy of that to direct it in more positive ways.
I think of the idea that no one should ever have shame. And if we have that as a foundational point of reference that we're operating from, lots of complications and tangles are inevitable if we begin with shame cannot be healthy and no one should ever have it. That's a really dysfunctional orientation, I would assert. I did mention previously about you know, a resolving of shame, a relaxing of chronic tension around shame. The idea that, so to study shame itself as just as a behavioral pattern or as an emotional pattern, we can have some appreciation and respect for it. We can see how everybody has slight variations on it, but you know, some similarity. The thing about like a relationship, or I didn't earn enough money to, you know, or that kind of a thought, or I don't have enough money, or whatever, you know, however it's framed. The idea is that there's a desire in the background to have more money, or to have a relationship persist, or to have maybe a partner who doesn't have the same concern for money. Maybe they're independently wealthy, or they just don't have the same standards. Maybe they're from, you know, Ghana, and they are used to living on $4,000 a year, and you know, have never lived in a place with running water. So there's all these extremes of, or all these different alternatives as far as what we can learn, what we can learn from a sense of shame about, I wish this relationship didn't fail, and it would have been successful if only blah 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 blah. So there's that whole thing that I just mentioned, where we can think, well, I'll get more money and then I'll be successful in relationships, or I'll find a woman who's not greedy and whatever, you know, materialistic. So whatever the solution is, those are all like trying to avoid future shame and do it right in the future, which makes sense. But I want to assert one other kind of weird thing here. What if I actually wasn't that satisfied in the relationship that was, you know, that I was quote unquote trying to save? So
I can relate, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm maybe I didn't have as much money as I would like. Maybe I would like more money. But independently of all those things, what if I wasn't really fulfilled or satisfied, and I did not want that publicized? That's the real thing I was ashamed about. And that's where you get into, like, I don't think I used the word sabotage anywhere before, but where people will end up attracting some kind of context for shame in their future. If I want to avoid, I remember this one. If I want to avoid like breaking up with a woman, then I do the things that lead to her breaking up with me, so that I save her the disgrace of me breaking up with her. And I remember talking about this. I did this in high school. I don't know if I've done it a lot, but I have done that, and knowingly, like I was so clear that that's what I was doing. And there was an element of shame, you know, like I don't want this relationship, and I don't want to just, you know, do a clean, direct, kind of mature, you know, private rejection. I don't want to reject her, you know. And whether it was good or bad, you know, that's just how it went. But I think that in many cases, the idea of saving for somebody from disgrace is not so generous and compassionate. It's really about me and my insecurity. So
yeah, for me, are brought up in that reflection for me and my experience is certainly I'm not interested in a relationship that you know gives me any shame and relates any of my own personal worth to whether I have money or not.
Uh-huh.
So, you know, in that light, you know, and I think that's probably a whole new conversation is, you know, feeling of worthiness.
Uh-huh.
But you know, I guess the key factor in you know when is shame justified and when it's not justified, and being
Okay.
able to kind of discern between the two.
Yeah, and that's it. You know, we can put it into a spectrum. We could put it just to a polarity, but yeah, when is it justified? When is it not justified? Or when is it productive or healthy or whatever word we like? So, I got the general idea, and I got that we could come back to those kind of things in another time. The general sense of shame can lead to chronic tension and inefficiency, as well as not noticing things. So to relax shame can allow me to just be more observant and more mindful, and I can be more playful with people because I notice things more. You know, I haven't said a lot about why we would want to resolve shame, but I guess there are some very clear, simple things, and I'll just jump ahead from there. Daniel, I wanted to give you an opportunity to speak, and we may wrap up here in a few minutes. So, what else would you like to say in general to Robert, to myself, etc.? Like, take a few minutes if you want to cover a few things. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you both for this call and everything you've had to say. But yeah, shame has been a big part of my life for a long time, so I can completely relate to a lot of what you're saying, and I appreciate and have learned a lot from this call. And that's all I have to say.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, I found it interesting too, and I appreciate you guys, sharing your thoughts and personal references and so on. We, as I said, as you know, I had this script written, but I like the process of talking with people about it because it not only allows us to connect and kind of set up a context where we can ongoingly have implicit permission to talk to each other about shame or any other intense emotion that we may have, but it also reinforces for me, no, it is okay. Robert isn't going to attack me or criticize me or condemn me because I said, yeah, I was ashamed, and I had an erection in high school, and in fact, more than once. Oh my God! But people can say, oh yeah. I mean, either you guys had the same experience, or don't care. That's another really nice thing is when I think other people are going to be really, upset about something, and I realize, wow, people really don't care about me in regard to that concern that I had. They may enjoy me, they may like jokes, they may appreciate me, there's all sorts of things, but they're not, in some cases I may find that people are not like upset if I use the word shit or whatever. In other cases, somebody will be really upset and disturbed and and I'll start to get cautious and I'll have to think before I speak. Well, I like occasionally at least to have some people to talk to, and I actually called Daniel several days ago, I guess Saturday or something, and just kind of spoke at liberty. And I don't necessarily do that very often, but I had the confidence in Daniel to be able to interact with me and follow along the conversation, even get something out of himself. Daniel, did you? I don't even remember what I talked about, honestly, off the top of my head. Did you get anything valuable that you recall from just being part of my venting and so on?
Yes, I got how just sometimes listening can completely benefit somebody.
Yeah. Okay.
And you do that, and you do that for me often.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Let's see. So the methods of reducing shame, obviously talking to people who we feel have the maturity and, you know, the willingness and ability to contain a conversation that may have some intensity. That's kind of the famous thing, you know, whether it's a support group or a one-on-one interaction, like what do you call it, confession with a priest. That's a historically common context in which people will reveal shame. I don't know if they explore it, but they can at least vent, you know. And then in a confession, people may be given some task to do that's like a symbolic gesture to kind of remind themselves that they are okay and that, you know, they are safe or whatever. Because in many cases, people are, you know, like I said, these kind of tensions that I carry from high school or whatever, they're not relevant to my current situation. I do not have those social contexts, but I can still have those social reflexes that I learned way back. And we didn't talk a lot about health or really mainstream media at all, but certainly where we get some messages about what we should be talking about and what we should not be talking about. A lot of that comes from movies, news, TV, you know, our interactions with people on Facebook can be counted. But as we get more and more mindful of these issues, we can recognize everybody's entitled to shame. It can be healthy. Everybody's going to have some different, you know, buttons. And if somebody's reacting with like, they're clearly disturbed by a subject and they're clearly upset, then do I want to continue the interaction on that topic, or do I want to either withdraw or take some action to like interrupt, intervene, apologize, whatever, so that the shame that may be arising for them into rage doesn't get directed at me. It's you know, simply for, it could be out of compassion for them, but I mean, first of all, out of like self-preservation. If I want to maintain a relationship and somebody's getting triggered into shame and then projecting it at me as at rage, then there's like questions of how to deal with that. So we're not going to explore that tonight, but I did want to emphasize this downline of things that go with shame. Resentment is always because something shouldn't have been how it was, which is shame. So I only resent things that I'm ashamed of having happened or that it didn't happen. Then I blame somebody. Why? To dissociate from the intensity of the shame. And also to protect myself from future, you know, emotional intensity. So if I push people away with blame, even if it's extremely overdone, then eventually I can create a degree of isolation or seclusion, and in that context, I don't have as much concern for immediate condemnation, right, from others. So I can begin to relax. Sometimes the solitude is really the biggest solution. So, any final words?
I want to acknowledge Daniel too and appreciate your input and all, and your ears for listening there, Daniel. And JR, it was good hearing you and kind of conversing and connecting here. So yeah, I'll try and join in on other Skype calls and look forward to the next topic.
Okay. And a real quick logistics, Daniel, did you want to maintain 10:30 p.m. and Tuesday night for next week?
Whatever's good for Robert. I mean, I'm very open.
Do you have a input on? You like 10:30 p.m., which is 7:30 for Pacific. You like that every weeknight, correct?
Yes, for me, yes.
Okay, so starting time is 7:30. Do you have a preference as far as days, Robert, that you want to mention now?
Tuesday works good for me.
Okay. Okay, cool. So we'll plan on next Tuesday, the 12th, and I'll stop the recording, and we can hang up the call in a moment as well. I thank you guys both again, and
because Robert, you had mentioned like that you might share. You'd been talking to your partner. You're also welcome to once I post the recording link. You're welcome to share it with her or anybody else you wish to.